The world as you know it is a lie built on the bones of 1,000-year darkness. While history books gloss over the maps, they forget the screams, the iron, and the absolute desperation of a civilization staring into the abyss. This is not a story of heroes, it is a story of a world that lost its mind. In the 11th century, the flame of Rome had been extinguished in the West, leaving behind a continent shrouded in what we call the long night of the Middle Ages. Europe was a graveyard of broken empires where the common man lived and died without ever seeing a written word. They were a people of the sword, led by lords who could barely sign their own names, staring across the Mediterranean at a world that was far older, far richer, and far more dangerous. The cradle of human civilization was on fire. To understand the shadow that was about to fall over the world, you have to understand the three pillars of power. In the east, the great Song dynasty of China was struggling against the northern tribes. In the center, the star of the Arab world was rising, a golden age of mathematics, philosophy, and conquest that had reclaimed the glory once held by Greece and Rome. And then there was Europe, a fragmented, illiterate collection of fiefdoms. When Rome fell, it didn't just take its legions with it, it took its soul. The Latin language, once the heartbeat of an empire, was now locked away in monasteries, guarded by priests. The kings and knights who ruled the land were warriors of muscle and steel, but intellectually, they were blind. This was an era where faith was the only compass, and that compass was about to point directly toward a collision that would last 200 years. But the Roman Empire had not entirely vanished. It had split. While the West crumbled, the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, remained a glittering jewel of wealth and bureaucracy. From the great city of Constantinople, the emperors looked down upon the Western lords as barbarians, unwashed, illiterate thugs who happened to be good at killing. But Byzantium was a rotting house. It was rich, yes, but it was exhausted. The centuries of war with the Persians and the rising tide of Islam had drained its spirit. By the time we reached the year 1071, the Byzantine Empire was standing on the edge of a cliff, and a new predator was moving in for the kill. They were the Seljuk Turks. They didn't fight like the Romans with heavy shields and slow formations. They were shadows on horseback. They came from the steppes with bows and camels, moving with a speed that the ironclad knights of the West could not comprehend. At the Battle of Manzikert, the world changed forever. The Byzantine Emperor, Romanos IV, led a massive army of 70,000 men to crush the Turkish threat once and for all. He had the heavy cavalry, the legendary cataphracts, armored from head to toe. But he was betrayed. In the heat of the battle, his own generals, driven by political greed and internal rot, turned their backs and marched their troops away. The emperor was captured, humiliated, and the heart of the empire, the Anatolian plateau, was lost in a single afternoon. This was the spark that lit the fuse. With the Byzantine shield shattered, the road to Jerusalem was open. For centuries, the holy city had been under Arab rule, but it was a tolerant rule. Christians could make their pilgrimages, pray at the Holy Sepulchre, and return home. But the Seljuks were different. They were new converts, zealous and uncompromising. They closed the gates. They began to tax, harass, and even kill those who sought the tomb of Christ. News filtered back to Europe, distorted by distance and fueled by the fear of a dark age that seemed to be getting even darker. In 1095, the cry for blood finally came from the throat of the Church. Pope Urban II stood before a crowd in France and gave a speech that would condemn millions to the grave. He didn't just ask for help, he offered a bargain with God. He told the knights of Europe that their sins, the murders, the rapes, the endless petty wars between lords, would be wiped clean if they turned their swords toward the east. He called for a crusade. He told them to take up the cross and liberate the Holy Land. To an illiterate population living in filth and fear, this was more than a war, it was an escape. It was a chance to be a hero in a world that offered nothing but hardship. But the crusade was not a unified army. It was a chaotic, surging tide of humanity. Among the thousands who marched, two men represented the duality of the movement. There was Bohemond, an Italian Norman lord who saw the crusade as a chance to carve out a kingdom of his own. He was a man of ambition, a wolf disguised in the robes of a pilgrim. And then there was Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey was the rarity of the age, a man who actually believed in the cause. He didn't just lead, he sacrificed. He sold his lands, his castles, and his heritage to fund the journey. He was a true knight of the old code, a man of profound faith who sought nothing but the fulfillment of a vow. The journey was a descent into madness. Thousands died of hunger and disease before they even saw a Turkish blade. When they finally reached the walls of Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor, Alexios, looked out at the Holy Army and saw a nightmare. He saw a mob of thousands of armed fanatics who were just as likely to sack his city as they were to help him. He forced their leaders to sign a contract, a deal written in the blood of future betrayals.
If we move at dawn,
he would feed them and guide them, but any land they took had to be returned to Rome. They signed the papers with a lie in their hearts, and the march continued. The first true test of this clash of civilizations was the Siege of Antioch. For 8 months, the Crusaders huddled outside the massive walls of the city. They ran out of food. They ate their horses. They ate their dogs. Some accounts even whispered of cannibalism in the dark corners of the camp. They were dying, and the great Seljuk relief army was closing in to crush them against the city walls. They were trapped between a city they couldn't take and an army they couldn't beat. It was here that the psychological warfare of the crusade took a supernatural turn. A monk claimed to have a vision of the Holy Lance, the spear that had pierced the side of Christ on the cross. He said it was buried beneath the floor of a local church. They dug into the earth, and to the shock of the starving soldiers, a rusted iron blade was found. Whether it was planted or a miracle didn't matter. To an illiterate army of believers, it was a sign from God Himself. The knights, skeletal and half-mad from hunger, burst from the gates of Antioch. They weren't fighting for land anymore, they were fighting with the fury of the damned. They shattered the Turkish army, a force far larger and better equipped, simply because they believed they could not lose. The path to Jerusalem was now clear, but the world they were entering was a fractured mirror of their own. The Islamic world was not a monolith. The Seljuks in the north and the Fatimids of Egypt in the south hated each other more than they hated the Crusaders. Just before the Crusaders arrived at the gates of the Holy City, the Fatimids had seized it from the Seljuks. They expected the Crusaders to be satisfied with a diplomatic deal. They didn't understand that these men hadn't walked 3,000 miles for a treaty. They had come for the stones. They had come for the tomb. The Siege of Jerusalem in 1099 was the climax of this first great horror. The Crusaders built massive siege towers from the wood of dismantled ships. They moved them to the walls under a rain of Greek fire and arrows. When the wall finally breached, the Holy Army turned the city of peace into a slaughterhouse. They didn't distinguish between soldier and civilian. They didn't distinguish between the mosque and the street. The chroniclers of the time wrote that the blood of the slain rose to the knees of the horses. It was a massacre that would stain the memory of the region for 1,000 years, a wound that has never truly healed. In the aftermath of the slaughter, the leaders of the crusade met to decide who would rule the broken city. They turned to Godfrey of Bouillon. They wanted to crown him king of Jerusalem. But Godfrey, the man who had sold everything to be there, looked at the crown and looked at the city where his savior had worn a crown of thorns. He refused. He said he could not be a king in a land where Christ was a servant. He took the title of Defender of the Holy Sepulchre instead. He lived as a guardian, not a monarch, and within a year, he was dead, likely taken by the very diseases and exhaustion that had claimed so many of his men. The First Crusade ended in a stunning, improbable victory for the West. They had established 4 crusader states in the heart of the Middle East. They had defied the odds, outlasted the empires, and reclaimed the Holy Land. But they had done so by sowing the seeds of an eternal conflict. The Islamic world, once divided and complacent, had been shocked into a new reality. They saw the Franks not as pilgrims, but as a plague that needed to be purged. As Godfrey's successors took up the mantle, the world prepared for the inevitable backlash. The illiterate warriors of Europe had carved out a kingdom of sand and blood, but they were surrounded by an ocean of enemies who were beginning to learn their tactics. The victory of 1099 was not the end of a story, it was the opening act of a tragedy that would consume generations. It was a time when faith was used as a whetstone for the sword, and the shadow of the cross fell long and dark over the cradle of the world. The First Crusade was a miracle of iron and madness, a moment when the dark ages of Europe reached out and grabbed the throat of history, refusing to let go for 200 years. This was only the beginning. The desert was thirsty, and it would soon demand a much higher price in blood.